Welcome to Interface. Today we have with us a prominent literary figure from the Arab world, Dr. Shihab Ghanib, an engineer by profession, a poet, an economist, a translator from Arabic to English and English to Arabic. Let us begin with a simple basic question, sir. How did you come across with Indian poetry and culture?
Thank you very much for this interview. It's a great pleasure and honor. Regarding your question about Indian poetry and literature, as a schoolboy, I was aware of major figures in Indian poetry like Rabindranath Tagore and Muhammad Iqbal, and almost nothing else other than that. Of course, I knew many Indian people and my grandfather, maternal grandfather, was a personal friend of Mahatma Gandhi, and he met back in the early 30s Sarojini Naidu with Mahatma Gandhi on their way to the Round Table Conference in Aden. So that was one also strong connection. Later I did a master degree.
That means you have your family has the connection with the Indian culture and Indian
Yes,
poetry.
because my grandfather also, he graduated from Bombay University as a barrister of law. So and some of my uncles also studied there, and I myself I studied first my engineering degrees in Aberdeen in Scotland in engineering, mechanical engineering and electrical engineering, and did management also in London and Birmingham. But then I did a water resources master degree at Roorkee University in UP. So I got to know India from corner to corner, because part of the master degree course on water resources was to visit the major water resources projects like dams and barrages and things like that. So I visited the north and the south, the east and the west, and so on. So I got to have a direct contact with India. For example, when I visited Agra and saw that beautiful great building Taj Mahal, I was astounded, and I wrote a poem about Taj Mahal.
You wrote a poem about the Taj Mahal and its beauty.
Then and I heard about other poets like Mirza Ghalib but that was my early experience with Indian culture, Indian science, you can say, because I have that was back in the late 60s. But later on, when I started translating some of my poems in a weekly corner, and also poems, I extended it to become poems from major modern poets of the Arab world. Every week I produced one poem. The Indians in the Gulf became aware of these translations, and for example, one of the poems was by a local UAE poet who wrote about a newspaper boy from Kerala who got killed by a car accident. He was selling these newspapers, so I translated it. People got to see the beauty of Arabic poetry translated into English, and later they wanted to honor me. So I was honored with the Kamala Suraya. She was at that time, 1996, Kamala Das, with the Yusuf Ali Ketchari. And they exchanged, she gave me her books, and I translated some of her very beautiful poems like Nani and in introduction into Arabic. And at the same time, Sachi Dhanandan heard about me and sent me one of his collections translated by himself into English, and I was quite impressed by the beauty and the originality of that kind of poetry. So I translated it into Arabic, and so on. It continued, snowballed, and the Indian community in the literary poets who were living and working in the UAE, they came to visit me and educated me on who are the poets of Kerala and India and so on. And I started to read more of these poets and to translate them, and produced volume after volume of different poetry. For example, the first volume was Qasaid min Kerala, poems from Kerala, and it had about 30 poets from Kerala. The second volume was poems from India, Qasaid from Hind, and it has
Qasaid min al-Hind.
Qasaid min al-Hind. This is the book,
Yeah.
and it has 50 poets from 12 languages from all parts of India. Starting from Mirza Ghalib and Tagore and so on, until the present day poets like Salma in Tamil Nadu, and of course different Indian languages, major Indian languages, about 12 languages. Yeah. So this was also very well received in the UAE and the Arab world. And later I did a full volume of Sachidanandan poems, about 50 to 60 poems. It was published by Kalima.
The former secretary of Kendra Sahitya Academy, Sachidananda.
Yes.
Yeah, that's all.
Yes, and also a volume very well known now called Ranina Turaya or Ya Allah by Kamala Suraya, and it was also published by the Kalima, and it has been discussed, this book, in several conferences of the Arab-Indian literary relations, and a little later I translated for Geeta Chabra some of her poems, and it was published in a book, both in her, because she writes her poetry in English, and I have the Arabic translations with photographs from the UAE, very beautiful photographs. It was produced as a coffee table book, yeah. And that was the fifth volume dedicated to only Indian poetry. But of course, I have published Indian poets all over in different
different states of India.
No, because in different states of India, but I have been translating world poetry, yeah, in several of my volumes, yeah, including Indian poets. And every time I try to introduce more and more poets. For example, in this volume I have several poets from India, including Sarojini Naidu.
Sarojini Naidu,
the Nightingale of India, who was known to my grandfather Muhammad Ali Luqman, who met her with the Mahatma Gandhi on their way to London for the Round Table Conference. At the same time, I have been also translated so far one volume in Malayalam, and I am maybe the first Arab to be translated, yeah, by himself in a volume in Malayalam, and it was edited and introduced, and also some of the poems translated by K. Sachidanandan, the famous Indian poet who is a Nobel Prize nominee, and also this volume by Nirmala, Dr. Nirmala Suresh, who translated Arabic poetry into Tamil, and including several of my poems, and also poems by Sheikh Muhammad, the ruler of Dubai, and other well-known poets like Ghazi al-Qusaybi from the Arab world.
In a sense, you have opened the window of Indian culture and poetry to the Arab world. How was the response of the Arab to this and Indian poetry and the culture?
It was, I think, immense. Not only that, it has, I have become known in amongst the literary circles and the cultural magazines and so on as the expert on Indian poetry, and it has appeared. My translations have appeared in various magazines and various newspapers, including Dubai Thaqafiyya, Al-Arabiya, Al-Arabi, and various other magazines. So it is, and people have appreciated this poetry. They were actually surprised because they didn't know, except Iqbal and Tagore. They knew only about Tagore and Iqbal. Nothing, and even they don't know many of their poems. They only know the names. Tagore maybe has been translated, and Iqbal has been
only after getting the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, of course. Only after he got the Nobel, and Iqbal, especially after one of his poems translated into Arabic, became a well-known Arab song by Kulthum, the famous legendary Egyptian singer. So, in fact, to a great extent, I have been instrumental in introducing Indian poetry, modern Indian poetry, because I have focused mainly on 20th century poetry and modern poetry, with a few exceptions like Ghalib and from older times into Arabic.
Yeah, a very personal question. You have translated Rabindranath Tagore, Mirza Ghalib, and Sarojini Naidu, and Sachidananda, and so many poets from all over India.
Yes.
And who is most favorite poet to you?
That is a really a difficult question, but I have found many of these poems I select usually are what I say poetry that crosses languages, crosses boundaries, which appeals to all human beings. It is humanistic kind of poetry. Values. That's what
having humanistic values.
Having humanistic values that appeals to all sorts of people. But for example, I enjoyed a lot the Kamala Suraya. I enjoyed Sachidanandan, and for example Shugata Kumari, and Tagore, of course, and so on.
There is what about that cultural transaction to the poetry? Is it possible to translate the complete meaning and the complete sense to the translation? There is a well-known quote that what is lost in translation is the poetry.
Yes, some people.
What is your personal experience as a poet, please?
I think in poetry, with certain poetry that depends on the eloquence of the language, you lose a little bit too much in the translation. That's why a poet like Al-Mutanabbi, our great poet, has not been given done justice in translations. But poems that have the meanings, the humanistic meanings, and the imagery, the pictures, these can be translated. The eloquence, the puns, the music, the rhyme and rhythm, that is lost in poetry. But it doesn't mean that poetry is lost. You can still have, because the poetry is also in the feelings, in the meanings, in also in the beauty of the imagery. But no doubt that this requires, in my opinion, a poet to translate poetry, a very good poet to translate poetry, who masters the two languages, and who not only masters the two languages, who knows the environment. For example, when you translate from the Indian language, and I have seen India and I have gone around all parts of India, I find that helped me in the translation. Same thing when you translate, if for example, when Shakespeare says to his beloved in his sonnet, number 18, he says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." Things like that. So he's comparing her to a summer's day. In our environment, in the desert, in the Arab world, the summer is so hot. You don't compare your beloved to a summer, because that doesn't sound like you'll say to spring or winter maybe. But here, when you know the environment, and I studied in Aberdeen University, and when we used to see the summer and the sun comes, we found it so beautiful. So I can appreciate what he is referring to. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So you have to know the environment. You have to be knowledgeable about the background, the culture, of the language, of the not anything mechanical. It is really, you have to redo the poem. You do a parallel poem to which, when you read it, somebody reads it, he finds the beauty of poetry in it, although it may not be an exact replica or copy or translation.
It's a well accepted fact that Sharjah is the cultural capital of the Arabian Gulf. How does it help you to flourish yourself as a poet?
I like the Sharjah. I appreciate so much Sheikh Sultan Al-Qasimi, who has given me several awards for his interest in culture, in promotion of culture and education in the academic city and so on. But the whole of UAE, Dubai also, and Abu Dhabi and Fujairah, and also in other places in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, and in Yemen, you have this interest in poetry. The Arabs all generally still remain to love poetry, because poetry was always the art number one of the Arabs since pre-Islamic days, since Imra al-Qais and Taraf ibn al-Abd and Antar ibn Shaddad and Zuhair bin Abi Sulma in pre-Islamic days. Still, poetry is the great art of the Arabs. Okay, after the World War, maybe other art forms came, the cinema and the novel and things like that have gained ground at the expense maybe of poetry to some extent. But poetry is still the great art of the Arabic language. Arabic language was based on this poetry and literature. Of course, the Quran, when it came, it kept it intact and has given the greatest example of beauty of the language.
Arabic poetry is nothing but meter and the rhyme. What's your comment on that statement?
Not really poetry, that's Nazm. There is people who can make a writing which, according to these rhythms and rhymes, but it may be devoid of the greatness of poetry. Lines of poetry remain, but I also think that the Arabic language was blessed with the advantage of rhyme and rhythm, which also carries you. I still write all my poetry with, whether it is the modern rhymes and rhythms, taf'ila kind of rhythm, or the classical two hemistish poetry, Amudi they call it. I still don't sacrifice this. I can write verse poetry, prose poetry, but I don't write it because I don't need to. I have this tool in my hand which adds to the beauty of poetry. But in my translations, I translate mostly into prose poetry, because there you can, if you impose on it a rhythm or rhyme, it may be sometimes contrived. It may be a little bit, artificial, and takes the attention from the original work to your new work, and you have to. But sometimes I have done that with success, with very few examples.
You are an engineer turned into a poet. Is the engineering craft affected your poetry craft?
I hope it hasn't done my poetry any harm, but I found that through a psychometric test that I use my right hand side of the brain and the left hand side of the brain exactly 50% each, which means the creative and the analytical sides of me are equal. So that's why I'm like a bird flying with two wings, and you have to be balanced with these two wings. But in the recent years after I retired, I have devoted almost all my time to poetry.
Some critics have opined that you are like Gibran Khalil Gibran with your craft. That's why I asked that question. What's your personal comment on that criticism or that observation?
Maybe it's partly true, because he was a humanistic person. Others, they compared me with Pablo Neruda and things like that. These are the reactions of readers who love certain poets, and they read and they think there is some in the spirit there is a similarity. But I am completely different from any of them. And even different from my father, who was my guide, a great mentor, and he had the same background, so I was influenced by him more than anybody else in my earlier years, and he was also guiding me and correcting my earlier poems. But a poet has to be his own voice, otherwise and he has to completely his own different personality and voice. Otherwise, he's just a duplicate of somebody else. That cannot work. But of course, Gibran was a great writer. He was more than a poet. His poetry was limited, but his writing of prose, the stories he wrote and the books, they had this element of ethereal poetry in it. And therefore, it is a big compliment to be compared to Gibran or Pablo Neruda.
Yeah. What is the present scenario of Arabic poetry in the Arab world, especially in the Gulf, especially in your United Arab Emirates?
Arabic, poetry continues to be important. We, unfortunately, the Arabs haven't been so successful in our affairs in politics and things like that, and in developing our sciences and our growth. But poetry, we have still maintained some very good poetry all throughout the ages. We had in the 20th century also great poets like Ahmad Shouqi, like Hafiz Ibrahim, like As-Sayyab, like Al-Jawahiri, like Nizar Qabbani, and like Mahmoud Darwish, and like Baradoni, like people like Muhammad Ghanem, my father, and so many great poets were throughout the 20th century. But and if you come to the Gulf, there are periods when there are no so exceptional poets that appear in any country. But for example, in Tunisia in the 30s, there was one poet who still remains to be the most well-known Tunisian poet, Abu Qasim Shabi. And you had the Mahjari poets who immigrated from Lebanon to America, like Ilya Abu Madi, Mikhail Nuaima, and Gibran Khalil, and so on. And they each of them become like a school, of a new, little bit different trend. And we had the Iraqis who started the taf'ila, like Nazik al-Malaika and Sayyab and Ali Ahmad Bakathir before them, and they all add, so there is a very rich tradition. But I can say that now I found in India and in Kerala in particular, there is a rich tradition of producing a new trend. And so when I add this to the readings of the literary people, they benefit and they develop, and it is an interaction between poetries and literatures and cultures that adds value to both sides. The same thing, I am sure. Unfortunately, in India, they have not translated many Arab poets. They have translated me to some extent, but they have not translated so many, except one or two. Maybe they translate Mahmoud Darwish and Zar Qabbani and Adonis. And because I asked my poetry friends in India, and they say we have heard of this and this and that, but very few of them.
Gulf has a good presence of Indians. Do their life and tradition reflect in the Arab poetry?
A little, very little, too little, because unfortunately they seem to be living in their own communities. They do have a lot of. They invite me, but I am maybe an exceptional case. They invite me so many times to their cultural programs and to be as a chief guest and to inaugurate functions and things like that. And I discovered that they are very active culturally. They enjoy a cultural life in the UAE at least.
Yeah, you have been translating a number of Indian poetry to Arabic literature. What is the similarities and dissimilarities between these two cultures as your personal observation?
What I look for, as I said earlier, in any poetry I read, is the values, the humanistic values, the beauty, the justice, the love, and so on, all the great values. I find that is not only in Indian poetry, not only in Arabic great poetry, but in all world poetry, because I translate also from all the languages without reserve, and I find that this value is available, but in small doses or big doses in different languages that poets I come across, and any such flash of humanistic poetry, I try to capture it and translate it. So as I said, it is a poetry that crosses languages, crosses cultures.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shihab Ghanim, for this wonderful meet.
Thank you very much for giving me this chance to appear on your programs.